Tu B'Shvat Sameach. I thought today it would be appropriate to make some comments about fruiting trees and what the Torah has to say about them, because I think somehow trees, by their nature, tend to fade into the background and not attract so much of our attention. And yet, from a certain perspective, you could argue that fruiting trees are extremely important to the whole worldview that the Torah espouses, and they really are almost kind of like the foundation or the skeleton of everything else, viewed from a certain perspective. And that goes back to the beginning, like in Sefer Bereshit, very early on, we hear about fruiting trees. So in the 7 days of creation, the third day, we have Petotzea Aretz de She'esev Mazri Azera Leminehu Ve'etz Ose Pri Asher Zar'ovo Leminehu Vayar Elohim Kitov. And the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after its kind, and tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after its kind, and Elohim saw that it was good. So that's just a first mention, and I guess if it were only that, then you would say, well, you have to mention something, and also fish are mentioned, and also birds are mentioned. So this is just part of the world. We have trees, and then we have trees in the world, and some of them bear fruit. Although I still think even at this stage, it is always interesting which details the Torah selects to focus on, because at the end of the day, there are a lot of things you could say about trees. Trees give shade. Trees can be chopped down and used for wood, which can be, either used to build, or it can be used to make fire, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of different things that can be said about trees, but there's specific mention given to Etz Ose Pri, the trees that make fruit, and also to their seeds, Mazri Azera, right? So it's not an arbitrary comment about trees, but rather a comment that's focused on the production of seeds, and that fruits are a way, seemingly, in the mentioning of that, because it says Osepri asher zar'o bo, that you have fruits that have seeds in them. There's this noticing that fruits are a way of distributing seeds, that trees produce fruits in order to help the seeds get around. And so anyway, yeah, but all we can say at this point is this is an opening passage that talks about fruiting trees. But then, of course, we go to Gan Eden. We go to the Garden of Eden, which is the second riff that the Torah gives us for, on what the beginning looks like and how to understand the beginning, in that case, more of humanity in particular. And now, of course, we notice that the central narrative of the beginning point of humanity's story in Gan Eden is about fruiting trees, right? It's about all these trees for eating from that HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts in this garden, Gan Eden. And then there's a specific tree, Etz Da'at Tov V'Ra, that Adam is commanded not to eat from. And there's also another tree that, or at least another name for a tree, which could be the same tree or maybe a different tree, called Bar-Hayim, the tree of life. And there's also a discussion of whether man will eat from that tree. So that is now a bit more striking, that, okay, we mentioned fruiting trees and their seeds in the beginning, and then now that we're kind of going back over with a second coat of paint or giving a different perspective on the beginning, fruiting trees are the central plot element in talking about humankind's capacity for relationship with divine command, right? That somehow there's something about the fruiting tree that is the talisman for the choice that human beings make of whether or not to obey their creator. And that is not an arbitrary thing. When you reflect on it, you say, well, what is a different story that could have been written? Why wasn't, instead of a garden with fruiting trees in it, why weren't we given a story about some people on a boat who are fishermen, or why, people who may have been hunters who were hunting animals on the plains, or all sorts of different ways people, even if you wanted to involve food, it wouldn't have to be fruiting trees, but also it doesn't have to be a story that's focused on food necessarily. So the Torah is admitting something fundamental and central about fruiting trees and our relationship to them that really cuts to the heart of what it is to be an Oved Hashem, and someone who's trying to properly serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu by keeping his commandments. And that is a question of, why fruiting trees, end up playing that outsized role. So we can comment on that and maybe circle back to it and speculate about it a bit. But I, before that, wanted to comment more on something slightly different, or maybe this will ultimately relate to the question I'm posing a little bit of, why fruiting trees matter so much, which is, well, maybe I'll make a few more kind of high altitude comments. So we just talked about the beginning, the 7 days of creation, and then Gan Eden. But fruiting trees are also important in the rest of the Torah. They're not always the only focus, clearly. But if you go all the way through and you think about the different mitzvot that are being taught in the Torah, we have the mitzvot of Orla, which is what Tu B'Shvat is actually about. The fact that you can't eat from the fruit of a tree that's in its first 3 years, because the fruit is called Orla, and then you have to wait until the tree is older. But once the tree is older, then you can eat from the fruit. And that's, you might say one miscellaneous mitzvah, but the greater centrality of fruits, it starts to be more apparent when you think about things like Shemitah, the 7-year agricultural cycle, because a central element of that agricultural cycle is that it's all about how you can't help fruit trees to be more productive for a year, every 7 years. So Shabbat is central to the Torah, and this is the Shabbat for the land that expands out to a 7-year cycle, and then really also a cycle of 7 groups of 7 years with Yovel and everything else. And at that level, when we're sort of zoomed out, the way that the Torah imposes the Shabbat is really, there's also an aspect with loaning money and setting slaves free, etc. But there's a central element here that has to do with making fruit trees productive, and what status fruit has when you harvest it in that year, right? That you have this fruit that comes from a tree that grows in the year of Shemitah, has Kiddushat Haaretz. It has a separate and different status than fruit picked from the same tree in other years. And so there is a essential role for fruit to play in the Shabbat of Eretz Yisrael. And then really there are a lot of other mitzvot as well that pop up where you start to realize that Torah is kind of going out of its way to push fruit to the center. Like, for example, in the laws of war, where you wouldn't think fruit trees really would matter when talking about conducting war. But we are given this mitzvah that says that when you besiege a city, that you are not permitted, when going into the city, to destroy it. When you're attacking it, you're not supposed to, as part of the siege, cut down the fruit trees of the city to deny your enemy the fruit, because the Torah is thinking about the long term, and basically saying, well, there's a poetic kind of rhetorical question that the Torah asks by saying, "Ki ha'adam etz hasadeh," like, is the person like, is the tree of the field like a person who can flee? And sort of the answer to that rhetorical question is no. Trees can't run away like your enemy can, and so you should kind of give the tree the respect that it deserves because it can't run away from you. So you shouldn't chop it down. But although that's an interesting, rhetorical way of talking about it, it also has to do with just thinking about the long term. Like, you're going to conquer this city, and then you should eat from the fruit of those trees, and the Torah says that you will eat from it. And so really, just like running from one end of the Torah to the other, there's this overemphasis almost on how we think about fruit trees, and that they matter a lot somehow to keeping the Torah properly, to having proper relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's interesting to ask the question why. And I think maybe we can return to that and speculate and comment about that a little bit. But I also just wanted to talk a little bit more specifically about the concept of orla, which is, again, this idea that we're supposed to wait to partake of the enjoyment that the trees are capable of giving us, that we have to let the fruit mature in a sense, or not the actual piece of fruit, but we have to wait for a year where the tree is more mature to produce the fruit before we can eat from it. And I guess one of the things that I think that it is interesting to locate there is that through this term orla, we realize again that the Torah is seeing fruiting trees as really having a very central role to play in the whole idea of the relationship that Am Yisrael are meant to have with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, because the word orla in the fruiting tree context refers to fruit that comes from a tree that isn't very old. But in the context of Brit Milah, which is circumcision, it refers to the foreskin that's removed during circumcision. And so this term orla is one we have from within the prophetic sources of the Hebrew Bible. So it's where we're being told to make an equation between these things. It's not just like a term we have from the sages that comes much later. And so we have to ask the question, what is the connection there? Like, why is the same term being used? And I think maybe, I don't know for sure that you can argue this definitely weighs down strongly on one side of the scale versus the other, but I've been interested in thinking about how maybe something that Moshe Rabbeinu says when he's agonizing over whether he can in fact convince the people to leave Mitzrayim and convince Paro to let them go, and whether he can lead them out. He says something about himself and that is meant to somehow express a sort of inadequacy or a likelihood that he's not going to succeed. He says that he is aral sfatayim. He says that he is one with, and now you have to translate aral sfatayim. So sfatayim is lips. Aral sfatayim maybe means that he has foreign lips, because the notion of the orla in connection with circumcision suggests a kind of difference in nationality. And so aral sfatayim in his context would mean that he speaks a foreign language, perhaps. But then there's also this question of, is it referring to the fact that he's kvad deo kvad lashon, as he also says about himself, that he has a kind of a speech impediment. And so the aral, the word referring to orla there, is maybe connecting with an impediment. But I wonder now, thinking in terms of orla as being principally a statement about trees in the Torah, whether if we assume that the fundamental meaning of orla has to do with the newness of something, that something is premature, that it is the first growth, let's say, and that the first growth has to be discarded because it's not suitable for use. that would fit with what Moshe is saying, because he, in a sense, has a message for the people that is going to fall flat in the beginning, right? That ultimately he is trying to bring them away from Paro to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he represents the Torah in its entirety, and he's trying to bring that message to them. And the first time and the second time and the third time, so to speak, that he's going to show them or tell them about what he has to help them discover, it's not going to be such an easy sale to make. And we see that explicitly in the text, that it's not so easy for Moshe to succeed in convincing the people to follow him, and that they should trust in Hashem. But there's also a kind of a more general statement you could make about the whole progression of events after they leave Mitzrayim, where they're following Moshe, and it's very hard to get the people to have the Torah sort of sink in and become natural to their way of life, that this is how they want to guide their actions and their choices. And if you read Aral Sfatayim, Moshe is saying about what he has to say, that there's something kind of premature in it. You could say that that's basically an accurate statement, that the people are eventually going to hear the Torah and take it on themselves, and they're going to make it a part of themselves, and it's going to sink in. But that isn't something that happens the first time or the second time, so to speak. It's something that maybe doesn't even really take in the generation that leaves Mitzrayim. And as we see, in the sin of the spies, when the spies go into the land and come back with fruit from the land, and then say, that the land is good and the fruit is good, but we can't fulfill the command of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and go into the land and take hold of it. That there's something that requires the passage of time, the passage of years, and maturation in order for what eventually arises to be successful and to be a good match. And so I think that one thing that the Torah sees somehow in fruiting trees is that they have something very precious to offer to humanity. But with the mitzvah of Orla, what we're being taught in part is that very precious thing that they have to offer is something that we maybe have to wait for in order for our relationship to what it is and what it has to offer us to mature. Like that we need to show HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we're capable of constraining our actions according to his mitzvot before we can, fully enjoy it and benefit from it. And that's similarly what Moshe is saying about what he has, his message, so to speak, has that property that it's not really just sort of like in its first version, what he has to say to Bnei Yisrael is kind of an immature fruit that they can't really benefit from yet, and that it's going to take time and it's going to take iteration and repeated attempts in order for it to really work and make sense. And I think that you can read also that meaning of Orla now back into the way the term is used with respect to circumcision as well, because again, it's like the idea that the first growth of something that ultimately has this great potential to produce seed and fruit, right? Like now talking in terms, the Torah literally uses the same term, zera, for seed, to talk about the seed of a human being who is going to have offspring. And that there's something though in the mitzvah of Brit Milah that again is saying that the first part of this living thing that grew, that could be capable of producing seed, you have to discard because the first growth is actually not going to be successful. That there's something actually about the passage of time, the maturation of one's relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the learning of the possibilities that are inherent in keeping his mitzvot, and the growth of a relationship from those mitzvot, that is necessary in order for the fruit that comes to be successful. And that's true whether you're talking about fruit in the sense of, pu or vu, like be fruitful and multiply, when you're talking about people, or it's true also when you're talking about fruits that you're eating from a tree that you planted in your garden in Eretz Yisrael. So I guess in the end, I don't know, we can zoom out a little bit and say, why is the Torah so interested in fruiting trees? I think it's because they seem in a deep animal way to human beings like this ultimate form of benefit and wealth, and because if you just contemplate what a fruiting tree is, it's this thing that once it's planted and once it's grown and it's in a sort of healthy and stable situation in the earth, and it's getting rain and it's getting sun every year, it just is a source of benefit to you without your having to do almost anything. Like, of course, you need to actually prune it and tend it a bit to make it more successful. But, that's about getting more out of it. Fruit trees are stunningly low maintenance in terms of what they can give to you as far as yield, right? Like that if you are someone who wants to eat fruit, like you're a human being, you're an animal that wants to eat fruit, you don't have to do to a fruit tree what you have to do to like plant grain to reap wheat every year, right? It's not the same kind of thing. It's a low effort, low maintenance situation. And so it is this kind of ultimate gift that HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes through nature to us, where the world is just full of these ways that we can sustain ourselves, that produce delicious food, and that do that just as part of the cycle of nature that we don't even have to, manage or control in any way. And yes, we can prune and sort of fertilize or whatever else that we might like to do in order to help the tree produce more food. But even if we don't do those things, that there's this fundamental way in which they're part of the world at large, just existing to benefit humankind and help us to thrive and flourish. And it's this ultimate gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu in that sense. But given that that's the case, that is precisely why it is so important for the way we relate to fruiting trees to be at the center of all of these questions and discussions about our relationship with the land and with other people and with HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, running first from Gan Eden all the way through the special mitzvot involving fruiting trees. Like, you have a fruiting tree, you can't eat the fruit for the first 3 years. You're demonstrating discipline and showing that you understand that this isn't just for you to take without acknowledging where it came from and who gave it to you. So you have these 3 years of not eating, and then a 4th year where there is a kedusha, and where the fruit is in principle dedicated to the Kohanim and to Avodat Hashem. And then the 5th year onward, then it's a fruit tree and you can eat from it. But that you're going to demonstrate discipline in order to send a message about your relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then with the waging war and the fruit trees again, waging of war and conquest of land is about acquiring land for yourself and your people. And so it's again about the acquisition of this benefit, because land benefits you in proportion to the number of fruiting trees it contains, in a sense. Like, it's obviously more complicated than that. Land has lots of uses, but fruiting trees represent at some level what you're like, the immediate wealth and value that you're grabbing onto when you conquer land. And the point is that showing disregard for the fruiting trees that are already there in the course of conquering the land and just saying, yeah, well, why don't we just clear cut everything, starve everyone out, burn it all to the ground, and we'll do with the land what we want later. Again, it's relating to the land as though it's yours to do with what you want, as opposed to showing respect for a gift. Like the fact that fruiting trees exist at all is like such a gift from Hashem that you should always be remembering it and disciplining your actions and constraining yourself with it. So I think in the end, and I mean, I can't help but remember, maybe in closing, partly because we just read Parshat B'Shalach over Shabbat yesterday, this midrash from Chazal that say that when the sea split and Bnei Israel were walking through, that there were fruit trees in the middle of the sea that they were eating from, that Bnei Israel had, so to speak, as a gift for them to sustain them as they were walking through Yam Suf. And there's various things that you could make out of what that might mean, what that midrash is referring to. I have in other places suggested, for example, that there's a reading of Kriyat Yam Suf that where you should be wondering whether there was kind of a dry isthmus through a marsh of reeds that they were actually finding, and that the fruit trees were always there because really they couldn't eat from the trees if they were just 10 seconds old anyway. But in any case, I think for our purposes today, that the midrash, one of the things it basically expresses is that fruit trees represent this ultimate gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, where you're at this moment where Bnei Israel are sheltering in his hand, right? That they've been just saved from annihilation by this miracle wrought by his mighty hand. They're walking through the sea, and that the fruit trees are there because ultimately there is a sense in which fruit trees are this unavoidable emblem of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's intention to sustain us and to help us to live and to thrive, that goes all the way back to Gan Eden from the beginning, that he wants most of all to relate to us as this parent who's fostering growth and flourishing, who has this gift to give to us to help us to live and to grow. But the wrong attitude about that gift and the wrong attitude about our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu that can begin with how things go off the rails in Gan Eden, but that really also has other ways of going wrong, as we have other things that we can do with fruit trees as we go through human history and the life and times of Bnei Israel trying to keep the Torah. The possibility of having of creating problems in that relationship is also inherent in this gift, and so on Tu B'Shvat, it's a very appropriate time for us to remember that fruiting trees are an absolute marvel, that they are a piece of the world and our environment, especially here in Eretz Israel, that just produces wonderful, delicious food for us, often with almost no effort from us. And that HaKadosh Baruch Hu understands the symbolic nature of that he understands that it's like an embrace from him, that we can experience just by with witnessing and benefiting from these fruits. But by the same token, there are many mitzvot and many stories involving fruiting trees in our Torah and in Tanakh, precisely because it is not meant to be something that we are indifferent to, that we take for granted, that we treat as though it's property for us to do with however we wish, without thinking about what it means about our relationship with our Creator, who gave that gift to us as well as all the others that we have.
A few thoughts I had. One, perhaps when it comes to making war, perhaps the idea that you're not supposed to hurt the fruit trees is a way of us keeping our perspective on things. In other words, when you go to war, you could end up, since by its nature it's destructive, you could end up having an overly negative view of the world, and lose sight of the fact that Hashem essentially, this world is a bracha that Hashem gave us. The fact that we have to fight evil, yes, that's part of our function, but that doesn't. But we have to remember that the world isn't evil. The fruits, are good. The fruits are good, and
Yeah, and even
people.
also that all people benefit from fruit trees, and that there's some common humanity that we share. Even with the people that we're fighting, that the fruit trees are a reminder of. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think I've wondered about also. I mean, this is something where it may be a fine detail question in halacha, so I don't want to kind of speak too speculatively and then say things that don't have enough real basis. I have wondered about whether the prohibition on damaging fruit trees given in the Torah also may have implications for how you're supposed to ideally be conducting warfare. And what I mean by that, and I again, this is a bit of a speculation because it might be that the specific conditions under which this mitzvah really is expected to hold are too limited for what I'm about to say really to matter. Like the scenario described in the Torah is besieging a city. But besieging a city maybe presumes that you're kind of surrounding a city, leaving one direction for people to flee, and then sort of trying to starve them out a bit, like in this practice of, softening up a city before you go in and attack it, as they do in the ancient world. And maybe then cutting down the trees is really about starving people specifically. And maybe it doesn't therefore pertain to just sort of a battle in the open field where two armies encounter each other. Maybe it might not be the case that you have to be so concerned about fruit trees in that situation. I'm not sure. I would be very interested in an exposition of the relevant halachot on this topic, because I confess that I'm not familiar enough with the detail. All of that being said, if you think about what it means to be constrained in some situation involving military conflict by a prohibition on destroying fruit trees, granted, of course, saving life, like pikuach nefesh, takes a lot of precedence in most situations. And so there are going to be situations in which you just say, like, well, you have to do it this way because we're going to save more of our people's lives this way. So maybe we'll destroy a fruit tree this way, but we can't avoid it. But if you leave that kind of an argument aside, it's harder to avoid destroying fruit trees if you do things from 40,000 feet with high explosive, right? Like the conduct of modern warfare or ultra modern warfare, where you're doing things like with the push of a button from a distance sometimes, and you're sometimes doing things with massively destructive consequences in particular areas where maybe there are fruit trees. I don't know. I wonder, and again, this is a speculation, I wonder whether there are situations in which you could say the conduct of war using a high-tech air force could be against the prohibition of destroying fruit trees, depending on the exact situation in which that's being done. I don't know. Again, maybe if like certain conditions of the definition of what a siege is are not met, this might not be relevant. But even if you blow up an empty building, as they often do, in Gaza, where they like knock on the roof and everyone runs out, and then they blow up an empty building, If you blow up an empty building and there's olive trees around it, is that a problem? Like, is it a problem that you're obliterating fruit trees in Eretz Yisrael? And does that mean somehow that the preference of the Torah is that you should be conducting warfare differently? You should be doing it by kind of being more involved and on the ground and knowing the terrain and not trying to kind of get away with what can be accomplished, from a distance or with high explosive. I don't know, but I've wondered about that question.
Perhaps, Dr. England, the prohibition is against Dafka purposely targeting the trees as opposed to
Also, yeah,
a situation where it's basically ancillary damage.
Yeah, so it could be like going back to the siege scenario. It could be that we're really just talking about you're deliberately chopping down the fruit trees either to punish the people, like demoralize the people that you're fighting, or to deny them the food from the trees, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, then it's like it's about intentional destruction. But I don't know. I think that is still to me an interesting question in halacha, meaning that if it's a psik resha, then to say like, well, I didn't intend to do that, but I did, of course, drop a bomb that necessarily will lead to the destruction of many such trees. If you're doing an action which always results in the thing that's prohibited, it may be a problem. You're right, though, that it may simply not be. It might be that depending on what the halacha is for this, it might be that you would say, no, if you don't intend to do it, meaning that you're doing some other action that happens to result in this, then there's no problem whatsoever.
Regarding, I found it fascinating you're referencing the different places where there's the Shorish Ayin Reish Lamed. Would you say that what you said jives with the following, that if we take the examples of the Brit Milah and the Orla of the fruits and Moshe Rabbeinu being Arel Sfatayim, we're going to take those three examples, that all three examples have an element of an initial type of sacrifice, an initial type of negative, which leads ultimately to the positive, the fruits. In the situation of Moshe Rabbeinu, his speech wasn't ideal in Egypt, so that was the initial negative, but he had to force himself to do it, and even though it wasn't the ideal yet, by doing that, it led to the ideal, which was later on the revelation at Har Sinai. And then with the fruits, you have the initial 3 years of fruits, which you can't use, but there's that initial sacrifice. Which I should also have added, not just sacrifice in the negative aspect, but also an aspect of sanctification, which then leads afterwards to first of all the fourth year, and what goes to Hashem, and the positive and all the positive fruits that come afterwards. And then with the Brit Milah, again, there's that negative and that sacrifice that needs to be done initially, and then afterwards, the fruit is all the mitzvot that the Jew does as a Jew.
Yeah.
You think that does that jibe with what you were trying to say?
Yeah, I think that the parallel you're drawing works. Although I would want to work on the case of Moshe a little bit, because I think there are interesting midrashim that flesh that out. So in the case of Brit Milah, definitely there's sort of the simplest principle of showing constraint or cutting back of something where it seems like you're carrying out an action that runs counter to the success or let's say the experience of benefit from something, because we're talking about the way that the male body, again, gives issue to seed. And Avraham is performing Brit Milah on himself. And this is before he actually is told that he's going to have a son named Yitzchak, right? So there's an association between Brit Milah as it's introduced in the life of Abraham and the introduction of the idea of Yitzchak. So Abraham, his whole life, has been unable to succeed in having a child with Sarah. And the performance of Brit Milah, which you would think, in a sort of naive sense, doing what seems like physical harm, or let's say reduction or cutting back of the part of his body that is his way of producing children, that seems like it runs counter to the success that follows, right? The success of producing an heir through Sarah, that immediately, is associated with and follows Avram's introduction of himself and his family and his clan into the Brit of Brit Milah. And so, yeah, I definitely think there's this element of, before you enjoy the benefit or the flourishing or the productiveness, the bracha, the bounty, that first you have to sort of hold back or restrain or limit. You have to discard the first growth of something in order to see greater benefit from and proper relationship to the following, the ensuing growth. And then,
Dr. Engler,
yeah, sure.
I can't resist but think of the analogy of muscle building, bodybuilding, that when you're trying to build up muscles, first you break them down for the sake of building.
Yeah, no, I think there must be a lot of things that actually, whether biologically or otherwise, actually work this way. That sometimes limitation can. I mean, in some ways, it's a much more general principle also in the Torah. Like Shabbat has this aspect to it as well, right? That keeping Shabbat is called, by our sages and understood in the Torah to be something that actually ultimately is a bracha to us that will lead to our flourishing. And you can understand that in different ways. Chazal tell a story of it's sort of a humorous but enjoyable version of a story where a goy hears a prophecy from some astrologers that this Jew on his street who is very punctilious about keeping Shabbat, whose name is Yosef, is going to get all of his wealth. That's what this goy hears this. And so in order to prevent this from happening, he sells all of his belongings and purchases a giant pearl that's of incredible value, and he carries the pearl around in his hat to make sure he always has it with him. And then the wind blows his hat off into the river one day. A fish swallows the pearl, fishermen catch the fish, and then Yosef, the Jew, goes to market and buys the fish for Shabbat, lichvot Shabbat, and then he gets the pearl. So there's this, and Chazal used that, as a way of talking about, if you keep Shabbat, then Shabbat will keep you, right? And of course, it also can be rationalized that, why Shabbat does this, that or Shemitah for that matter, that there are these things that the Torah asks of us where we restrain ourselves, and it seems like you're going to get less. Like, oh, you're only going to work 6 days a week instead of 7. You're going to have 6/7 as much wealth. Whereas, of course, if you spend 1 day a week lifting your eyes from scrabbling in the dirt, you actually, as a society, can come to realize a lot of different ways of doing things, and discover that there's activities that you can cultivate in yourself, l'shem shamayim, on Shabbat, that turn out to have side benefits in terms of what kinds of economic capabilities they allow, for the rest of the week. And so you end up producing more wealth in a society that, has Shabbat and keeps it in the right way. And also with Shemitah, I mean, Shemitah is following the 7-year pattern of the booms and busts of the agricultural cycle in Egypt that are described with Yosef HaTzadik. So it's like fire drilling for famine, basically, that every 7 years you don't try to make the land productive. And what you end up doing is cultivating in your society the capacity to, through trade and through herding and through, a diversified economy, survive a year where you're not going to try to make the land productive. And that turns out to be tremendously more wealth producing than just trying to subsistence farm your way away from extinction every year without interruption. So Shabbat and Shemitah are like this also, and many other things in the Torah, I think, as well, where the restriction can actually carry with it a bracha or a benefit. But specifically with Brit Milah, I think you're identifying something more, directly parallel. And with the fruiting trees, it's sort of the most obvious instance because it's laid out as like this is the proper halacha that you create sanctity and propriety in your use of something through limitation, discarding the first growth, and then you get the benefit of the rest of your life eating the fruit from the tree, and then so it's an emblem of that. But I think in the case of Moshe saying that he's Aral Sfatayim, when you were talking, it made me think of the midrashic discussion of how Moshe became impeded in his speech, because there was this omen or prophecy or what have you that Paro was given that there would be this child, of the Hebrews who would, rise up to destroy him, and he was suspicious that perhaps Moshe, as a young child, was this foretold destroyer, and so he places 2 bowls in front of this toddler Moshe, one filled with gold coins and one filled with burning hot coals. And the point is that if he's a smart child, then he'll grab the gold, but he won't grab the coals. Even though the coals are sparklier, he'll know that they're dangerous and he'll know that the gold is desirable. And of course, Moshe is very smart, but the Midrash says that Hashem sent a malach to make Moshe grab the coals instead. So he grabs the coal and puts it in his mouth, and that burns him, and that gives him his speech impediment. There are many things I love about this Midrash. I think it's fascinating. One of the things that is clearly being referenced there is this passage in Yeshayahu, where Yeshayahu says, I can't speak the word of Hashem because my lips are impure. They're tmeim. Like he recognizes somehow an insufficiency in like the human form as a vessel for the word of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so a malach takes a burning coal and touches it to the Navi's lips, to Yeshayahu's lips, and says, okay, your lips are now purified. You can speak the word of Hashem. So Moshe has become impeded in his speech by this coal that burned him. But there's another sense in which we're really being told that this is somehow the beginning of his capacity for nivuah, that what he's going to become begins with this cutback, with this limitation, but actually is going to enable him to speak the word of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a way that perhaps somehow he only could because of this impediment. And understanding what it actually means that the impediment was somehow necessary, I think, that I sometimes wonder if it's connected also with another statement we have from Chazal that in the present era, nivuah is only given to children and shotim. Like shotim are sort of the like halachic definition of an imbecile or a mute, like someone that somehow nivuah is very connected with seemingly dysfunctional speech. And it's because there is something, I think what it may be a reference to at some level is that from HaKadosh Baruch Hu's perspective, we are like children who have trouble learning to speak, right? Like that being partners in dialogue with Hashem, there is something we by default kind of lack in our capacity to hear him and to learn his language and to speak to him with clarity. And that it might be actually people who have other difficulties with speech involving other people, like normal speech, who may have a greater disposition to realize what it's like to speak with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because they're not so railroaded into the limited forms of speech that human beings prefer to use with each other.
Yes, I was trying to think regarding a type of, a parallel between Brit Milah, where there's something counterintuitive happening because there's damage being caused to the very function that will, or bodily part that eventually leads to the fruits coming.
Mhm.
And here with Moshe Rabbeinu, we're talking about the mouth from which the Torah came.
Mhm.
So it's hard to not see some type of a parallel where he's it's that initial, I don't know if we want to call it sanctification, something that had to be done in a sense, like some type of a setback, but it was all for the sake of that mouth ultimately bringing to humanity more than any other mouth ever brought to humanity.
Mhm. Yeah. No, I think that's clear in the text, and even there are other indications that this is what's going on, because, for example, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is explicit in saying to Moshe, you speak to Aaron, and Aaron will speak to Paro. Like that there is, like, why does Aaron need to be there? If Moshe knows what Hashem has to say, why can't he just say it? And that is all that needs to be said. But there's something kind of not fully translated, like that Moshe is the only one who can speak pe el pe, panim el panim with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the way that he does. But that something in that ability is inseparable from a limitation that he experiences in communicating with other people. And so someone like his brother, who maybe knows him better or is closer to him in ways that are relevant, has to be there as a translator in order for the message to get all the way through.
It also may be that the ultimate level a person can achieve is much higher and much more lofty when he overcomes his own initial natural inclinations to overcome them and rise above them, as opposed to a situation where Moshe had just been born a natural orator and then he naturally went on to the position of being the communicator of Hashem's word. Here he had to overcome, and maybe in some way that also is just a model of what every Jew should strive to be, which is overcome your natural negative characteristics to achieve greatness.
Yeah, I can see that, and I think that that's right, that there's an element of that, certainly. What's tricky is to think about, I mean, you wouldn't say that if you're trying to get good advice on what you should do with your life, think about the thing that you're worst at and have the most difficulty with and do that. Like that feels somehow too simple, and clearly, in one sense, it's reasonable and natural for people to incline to activities that make the best use of their natural talents. But what's true is that if someone does, because of necessity, work out a way of overcoming an impediment that they have, I guess the way to put it would be to say, we should always be thinking about things that we have the most difficult time with, and which of them are ones where it seems like HaKadosh Baruch Hu really wants us to power through that and work out a solution to it. Because it might be that, like I'm not, there's a lot of things I do badly. Some of them I don't have any sense that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants me to try to get better at them. And so I won't necessarily incline towards those, but if there's something that I do badly where I start to realize like it's a problem that I do this badly, it's gonna be a failure that will either be I'm failing Hashem or I'm giving into some weakness of mine and making something worse of my life because of it or whatever. If you have kavanah to serve Hashem better by overcoming this impediment, then certainly it must be that if you succeed in doing so, then there's great bracha in that, and then you are, and part of that is kind of built into the equation. Like people who overcome things that are very difficult for them, they had to figure it out. They had to think about how to do it well. They had to develop a method. And so they stand in a place where someone who never had to think about how this works can never stand. And then I'm referencing now a related Ma'amar Chazal, which is that the Baal Tshuva stands in a place where the one who was always a tzaddik can never stand. That if you come from a place of let's say you were a Rasha, like Reish Lakish, who was a criminal or something, and who became a sage of the Gemara, Reish Lakish is capable of teaching Torah that no one else could teach. Like the Gemara describes how he teaches about the tumah of kelim, like the ritual impurity of implements, because he actually murdered people with weapons or something. And so he really understood something about what was being discussed that someone else who had not wielded weapons in that way wouldn't necessarily have understood. So when you come somewhere from an unconventional path, which you by definition are doing, if you become good at doing something that you were uncommonly terrible at doing initially, then you have a different perspective, and it becomes part of the bracha that's due to you for having done that. L'Shem Shamayim.
Thank you very much, Dr. England. Tu b'Shvat Sameach.
Thanks very much. Chag Sameach.
Okay, Chag Sameach, Laila Tov.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.